Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Gay or Muggle land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. Love, Rinse, Repeat is warmly supported by Uniting Mission and Education, and if you want to check out more about what they've got going on, including their upcoming Preach Fest, check out the notes below. I have a wonderful guest today joining me from across the pond in New York, Brett Krutzsch. Welcome, Brett.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to get to talk to you today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into this conversation. For those who don't know, Brett is a scholar of religion at New York University's Center for Religion and Media, where he serves as editor of The Revealer, a monthly online magazine about religion and society. He is an expert on religion and LGBTQ history and is the author of Dying to be Normal, Gay Martyrs and the Transformation of American Sexual Politics from Oxford University Press. And the book was actually a 2020 Lambda Literary Award finalist for Best LGBTQ Nonfiction Book of the Year. So I'm really excited to talk about Dying to be Normal. I was just saying to Brett before, I've really been loving reading it. Yeah. So I'm just curious, I guess, for those who don't know anything about the book, it's kind of the book highlights, you write through how through the process of commemoration, secular gay activists deployed Protestant Christian ideals to present gays as similar to upstanding heterosexuals and therefore as deserving of equal rights. It illuminates how religion contributed to the mainstreaming of gays through this, use of turning particular figures into these martyrs. So just giving people the broad strokes of, I guess, how you came to be interested in this idea, how you was it a pattern you started to think about noticing and then were like, let's see if this actually, this holds, or how did that kind of process come about? And just, then just a bit of that spiel of the book as a general beginning.
Sure. Well, thank you for your kind words about the book. I appreciate it. So I was doing my PhD in religion and was working on a very different topic about queer Orthodox Jews. And in the United States, there was a college student, a freshman who committed suicide, a gay college student who committed suicide by the name of Tyler Clementi. And one of the things that followed from that was an internet campaign called It Gets Better that some people may remember. It was started by the sex columnist Dan Savage and his husband, Terry Miller. And the message of it, which was incredibly popular, so lots of heterosexual people got involved, including President Obama, lots of celebrities. The message to LGBTQ adolescents was, we know life might be bad, but stick it out, and we promise you it will get better because it got better for us. And in spite of its popularity, I found that message troubling, confusing, to make this declaration that for everyone life improves. Worry not about the traumas you're going through now. It will all just somehow, something will happen that will magically make adulthood great for all queer people. And so I started thinking about what messages, what cultural messages, what common sense ideas allowed so many people to think, well, yes, obviously life gets better as you get older. And so a lot of that has to do, I think, with race and class. So then it was started by two white upper middle class men, but also it has, what I argue, some religious resonance packaged quite differently, just in secularized forms. And so one thing that I first started thinking about was, how do some Christian ideas circulate in our culture without being named as Christian ideas? So the one that I thought applied to this It Gets Better idea was that of redemptive suffering or redemptive sacrifice, that suffering or death can have a purpose, and life will improve because of that. But that's a particular, idea. It's not certainly one that we can say is universally agreed upon. And so the fact that so many people were willing to accept it was what I thought was interesting. So I became then intrigued by this idea of how might LGBT politics, religion, and death be coexisting in the struggle for greater equality. And that took me then to look back at other prominent moments when a queer person's death captured the nation's attention and why others did not, and what those things revealed.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's helpful to get out at the beginning, that you're not necessarily looking at, the role of religious organizations or figures in the shaping of the push for greater acceptance and equality. It's particularly the way religious ideas, particularly Christian Protestant ideas, were kind of adopted, subverted, changed, but engaged to push this through. I think that's really interesting. And so, the other figures that you kind of talk about early on is Harvey Milk, and then you talk about Matthew Shepard, and then Tyler Clementi you mentioned. And it's interesting to think about. And there's so much to get into, but I think one thing that you're already kind of putting out there is that the story of a move for inclusion is necessarily, in this case, a story also of a push for exclusion. That those who were highlighted and made prominent were done so because they could fit a narrative, or at least could be maneuvered to fit a narrative. Maybe we'll come to more to that point too. But maybe just curious about, I guess, that as it developed, where you saw that kind of that interplay of inclusion and exclusion. Because as you say, necessarily was about trying to appeal to this kind of particular picture of what a normal American citizen is, and why, and that being the basis of why we should care.
Exactly. So I came to think of it exactly as you said it, that the process by which certain people within the LGBT community, mainly cisgender gay men and women, came to be regarded as just normal citizens in the fabric of the United States, that process was also really one of exclusion, and that there were people who were further marginalized so that other people could have greater social acceptance and greater legal standing. And so the book looks at this, it's really bookended by a 2-decade period. It largely starts in 1995 and then goes to 2015. So 1995 is when medicines were introduced in December 95 that changed the AIDS epidemic, which largely allowed LGBT activists to focus on things other than AIDS, and it allowed gay and bisexual men to not sort of carry the stigma of having been harbingers of a plague through sexual frivolity. And then in 2015 is when same-sex marriage became legal throughout the United States. And then the book's epilogue looks at the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting, which was the greatest mass murder of LGBT people in the country's history. And what's notable about that is that it's really the first time where there was national recognition and mourning of queer people of color, that there had been attempts earlier by activists to turn people into someone like a Matthew Shepard or a Harvey Milk, who you mentioned, but those attempts largely never reached the same level of prominence that these overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly gender normative, overwhelmingly Christian, or in the case of Harvey Milk, who was Jewish, made to look like he was Christian. And those are the narrow parameters that seem to produce empathy and concern among heterosexuals. So there have been lots of, unfortunately, LGBTQ people who've been murdered, who died from AIDS, or who committed suicide. But what I was really interested in is who were the ones who really got heterosexual people's notice to want to do something to change the conditions of the country.
Thank you for that. So I'm curious now to talk about a bit about that. Somewhat the process that needed to happen in order to make some of these victims to grab that attention, to be palatable. So as you said, you mentioned Harvey Milk. We'll start there. So you kind of bring up two particular things that are kind of pushed aside or somewhat, removed from the legacy of Harvey Milk in the way that he is presented. And the Milk is an interesting category because you kind of talk about both the initial impact of his death and then the way his figure and legacy was revived as this the gay MLK later and really picked up. And so those two things are his Jewishness that you just mentioned. And you draw out the fact that he is, through artwork represented as this kind of crucified Christ-like figure later. And then also his, that he was engaged with, multiple sex partners and the like, that his sex life becomes either kind of pushed to the side or just made a bit less of a prominent thing, and it becomes much more about his legacy and in particularly his death. It kind of mutes all other details of his life. So yeah, I'd be curious about a bit about that process of, as I say, to make a martyr is it's almost it is a thing you make in some respect as much as recognize.
Right. Well, the first thing that I learned from other people who've looked at martyrs, like MLK, and then throughout, really Christian history and other religious traditions, is that martyrs are really malleable, and they often don't represent the person who lived. They often are used by people in the present day to make various political arguments. So martyrs change over time and can represent different things. And one of the first things that intrigued me about Milk, so Milk, who was one of the first gay Americans elected to public office. He wasn't the first. There were women lesbians who predated him, but he was one of the first, is that he sort of had local recognition in San Francisco, which was where he was an elected official. And he had some national recognition, but his popularity explodes many years after his death in this 2-decade period that I focused the book on after 1995. And one of the first things that intrigued me about him was that in 2003, the first LGBT history museum opened in the United States, and its very first exhibit was of the suit that he was wearing when he was shot to death. And the inaugural exhibit at the first LGBT history museum was of Harvey Milk's suit hung as a cross for everyone to come in and see. And I forget the title but it was something about the life and afterlife of a modern day gay martyr. And so my first sort of thoughts about this were, why would the curators of this LGBT exhibit turn a secular Jew into this Christianized memorial? And then I found that was happening constantly in the ways that he was memorialized in plays and operas. He was constantly being crucified and resurrected, and that the familiarity of these Christian motifs seemed to be a way that people could position Milk as you described him, the gay MLK, which is eventually how activists started to use him as a figure that might have resonance for heterosexuals. And so one of the arguments that I make in the book is that to make him palatable to a broader audience was to downplay the particularities of his Jewish ethnicity. He was a secular Jew. He was able to converse in some Yiddish. He participated in Jewish holidays like Passover Seder. A lot of that gets really downplayed when he becomes the gay MLK, so that he can function more as like the sort of American everyman who happens to be gay. And then what also gets downplayed is not only his own individual personal sexual and romantic life that included, having more than one sexual romantic partner at a time during some points of his life, but also that he had developed a sexual ethic that actually reflected some of the conversations around opening up sexual ethical possibilities in the 1970s that for Milk and for others whom I think he was in conversation with, that monogamy could be rather limiting and furthers this idea that you possess someone or you are possessed by someone. And he felt that if everyone could be honest with everyone else, that it was possible to love more than one person at the same time. And if you were able to share more than your love with more than one person at the same time, and multiple people were able to share their love with you, that actually could have an impact on the community, that sharing of romantic and sexual love would have ramifications on how we treat one another if we're not constantly paired off. But that has been almost totally obliterated in terms of how he becomes an emblem, in large part, I think, because just a few years after his death, we enter the AIDS crisis, and gay men in particular were so vehemently vilified for having for being seen as being sexually promiscuous, and through that sexual multi-partnerism that they brought about this plague that then spread throughout. And so I think as a reaction to the stigma that gay men had invited a deadly disease through having sex with multiple people rather than monogamously, that it just became not possible for activists to emphasize that sexual ethic in the wake of this deadly epidemic.
Mm. Yeah, think of that. And I think, because as you say, like so much of it is about how were these figures employed to appeal to those outside. And as you say, about a few of the figures in the book, it's kind of pointed out that it's like, look, if it weren't for one aspect of their identity, they would be embraced. They would be the person you would, love to have in your life and as a friend or a son or and it's this one thing that we're asking, but that obviously means you have to then show, that everything else looks like how you expect it to look or would want it to.
Yes.
I think that's. You were talking then about obviously the AIDS crisis and the stigma and the shadow that casts obviously informs so much of this. And it's interesting, like, to stay with Milk, but also I guess kind of moving towards Shepard in some way, the way that their deaths could be kind of held up as they were in no way responsible for their deaths, right? Someone beyond them came and killed them. Whereas, the language around those who were dying from AIDS was, that they are in some ways, because of this lifestyle, responsible, so I guess, interesting to talk a little about that, and the way, I guess, that somehow, do you feel that then somehow confirmed, or at least gave credence to that notion then, that there were some deaths, yes, that were people had more responsibility for, compared to these ones, by upholding those ones, by centering those ones, you are in some ways giving credence to the voices that are saying it about the other community.
Right. I mean, your point is exactly right, that in order to be revered as a martyr, it certainly seems that one has to be considered innocent. And again, these parameters for innocence are actually quite troubling if we want to have, an embrace of a diverse society. And so, so Harvey Milk, he was very clearly murdered alongside the mayor of San Francisco. And then we enter the AIDS crisis, and in spite of we don't know the numbers exactly because so many people were not out at the time. AIDS outed many people, but the stats in the United States are that between 1981 and 1995, somewhere between 90 to 100,000 gay and bisexual and trans Americans died out of a total of 350,000 in that first 15 years. And there wasn't a queer AIDS martyr. The person who was most regarded as the AIDS martyr was this teenage white Christian adolescent by the name of Ryan White. His last name was literally White. And he was a hemophiliac. So he had gotten HIV from a blood transfusion. And his school refused to let him return to school. He had been sick and then he got better, and the school said, you can't come back, out of their fear that he could be contagious. And so his mother sued, and it became national news. And what was so revealing about the Ryan White case was that for years, as gay and bisexual men were begging for the country to care, people like Larry Kramer who are just screaming to get attention, that this is devastating people. It largely fell on deaf ears, but when Ryan White's case became known, the reaction was so different. He became friends with lots of celebrities. There was made-for-TV movies about him, books about him, lots and lots of press. When he died, the first lady at the time, Barbara Bush, attended the funeral. CNN broadcasted his funeral so that all Americans could participate in publicly mourning the boy with AIDS, which is what they called him. And so that, to me, became sort of a model of like, okay, so if you have to be like Ryan White for Americans to care, you've got to find someone who is just really pure and we can't associate sex with them because of the stigma. And so then enter Matthew Shepard in 1998, just a few years now after the worst of the American AIDS crisis, when this image is starting to change. Now Ellen DeGeneres has come out a year earlier in 1997. Will and Grace has just premiered. So there's starting to be some pop culture changes, often of desexualized gay and lesbian characters, white gay and lesbian characters, middle class. But then, so Matthew Shepard becomes and remains the LGBTQ death in the United States that has garnered the most attention. And he was a college student. He was 21, so legally an adult in the United States, but he looked much younger. He actually looked like Ryan White. He was only about 5 foot, 2 inches tall. He weighed 105 pounds. So he looked like, a young adolescent, and therefore could be desexualized. And activists described him, as you were mentioning earlier, like he could have been anyone's son or your little brother. And so this language served also to desexualize him. So any of that earlier stigma about gay men and being hypersexual, and that leading to them being responsible for their own deaths. Now here you have this figure who we're told is not only quite young and like the next door kid, that he was also a practicing Protestant, an active member of his Episcopal church, who had joined only 2 clubs when he started college, one for LGBT students and one for Episcopal students. And so not only is he white and middle class and in college and doing all the supposedly right things, but he's also a committed Christian, which gives now straight Americans this new image, because he becomes, for many people, the first image of a gay committed Christian. He certainly wasn't the first. There were many others who had been in the press earlier, but he becomes the one who gets the most national attention. And so there were memorials of people and marches that included heterosexuals and straight politicians throughout the country. And then the Laramie Project, which becomes this play about his murder, at one point was one of the most produced plays in the United States. It went around the world. And so, so it's this idea that, you have to be innocent in order to be accepted as someone whose death we should all pay attention to. And then how can activists use that for political advantage?
Yeah, I think that's really well laid out in that chapter of just how much he could fit every bill kind of thing, in terms of, okay, great, this is who we can use now. And one of the things you point out is just how quickly and immediately the connection of crucifixion, of sacrifice, of passion, in the Christian religious term, became like, that wasn't something that was happening very quickly. And so much so that you kind of talk about how quickly people, and I was thinking about this, because I think I was introduced to Matthew Shepard through seeing the Laramie Project, just a decade or more ago. But just how many people think about him being actually tied up in a crucified pose, right? That becomes the image, even though he was actually in like a handcuffed pose. But yes, it was so interesting just that wasn't even something that like slowly built in, but was kind of seized upon immediately. And so I guess I want to kind of go think about that aspect of the linking of his death to Jesus. You also talk about Terence McNally and Tony Kushner as playwrights, who also make this connection of Christ and Matthew Shepard as brothers, kin, tied through this experience. And so I guess the effect that you start to do then is that, by making this connection to Christ, who for many people will have this connection of, was born to die, essentially, that was the path. Yes, Christ did a lot of things, but essentially it was all in movement toward his death, which was led to life, salvific for others. And so by making that, then there's a claim being made that this death has meaning, and a particular kind of meaning, has significance, and almost in some way needed to happen in some way. And I guess that there's a problematic that is kind of problematic in way both that it takes away someone's actual life to make it about something more. And I'm just curious about how you see that all playing a part in that danger of almost ascribing a meaning because you talk about it a bit with Milk too, that there's, a documentary made about him, which starts with the death. So again, it's like everything you're about to see about his life is about coming to this point. Because I know that's something even within Christian theological circles that people sometimes say, maybe we should think about the Jesus thing differently. But just about that with Matthew Shepard in particular, that immediate kind of consuming the whole act into this image of sacrifice.
Right. And we have no idea if he wanted to be an icon or used for any sort of political things. And I say that with some trepidation because his mother has done lots of work for LGBT equality, and I think she may have had a sense of what he would want or not, but we don't actually know. And we can't really say that his death had a purpose. I mean, one could, but that it does have a certain religious undertone or overtone to it. And there are many people in other religious traditions or who are not religious at all who, would push back against this idea that death has to have meaning, and that actually can be quite damaging to people if you always have to put meaning on traumatic and catastrophic events, and doesn't allow us to fully then untether all the things that lead to catastrophes and to horrific things. And I think it just further speaks to, the immediate assumption that he was crucified, right? So he had been tied to a wooden fence. It was a wooden fence with crossed post. And so there was this immediate assumption that he was in a crucified position, and people ran with that. And I think that again speaks to how one of the ways that Christianity's sort of insidious dominance is the way it occupies how people think about how you memorialize and how you present emblematic figures to the masses. That this is I talk in the book about the cultural currency of Christianity because it's so well known that you can just sort of make these leaps and everyone's sort of on the same page. And that gives a political figure or a martyr more power and a broader audience.
Yes, thank you. I think you're right that, it kind of is that testament to that power that, this whole book exists, right? That this move happened because people felt that you could make this appeal, and even for those who aren't Christian or whatever would resonate with it, and that it would have an impact. It
matters. A lot had been written about Matthew Shepard as being so prominent, and largely because of race, which is certainly true. His whiteness is 100% central to this, but it's also quite important, I think, that he was a practicing Protestant, right? And had he been all the same figures but Buddhist or an atheist, it just wouldn't quite have aligned right. That he not only died in a way that people could compare to Christ, but that he himself, we are told by the people who knew him, had a relationship with Christ and was committed to being a practicing Protestant, really matters in terms of him being acceptable to such a broad audience. And to people, there were lots of articles that I put in the book where they would interview heterosexual adults who would say things like, I felt like he could have been our son. And so for that to work, all of these things sort of had to either be a part of who he was, or that he needed to be molded in a few ways to look that. And one of the things that I think I say in the book is that as time went on, people started to question the Matthew Shepard story as it had been initially told to the public, as activists and the people you mentioned presented it, that he could have been killed not because he was gay, but because there might have been an issue involved with drug dealing gone awry or something else. Or that he may have had a sexual relationship with one or both of the killers and whatever. But for me, I was never interested, because I don't think it's possible to uncover what actually happened, why he died. For me, all of these other reasons, it shouldn't matter if he had used drugs, or if he had had a sexual relationship with these high school dropouts. None of those things should mean that his death was less significant. And it's concerning that the only way for so many people to care is if he fits this desexualized, Christianized, white middle class model.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what comes through again and again in the book, is that if you were training the American public to care for gay people and the causes of gay rights and equality, but you train them by only recognizing a particular kind of person as mattering, then, as you say, anytime that someone tries to elevate a figure that is different, that is gender non-conforming, or a person of color, or poor, or a drug, whatever it might be, it's going to be impossible. And you only really step forward in terms of incremental gains for those who, as we've already talked about, would be on the top of the social hierarchy were it not for one aspect of their identity. One other thing you kind of talk about with Shepard again, which imitates kind of a religious motif, a Christian motif, is the amount of people who say he was the first gay person they ever met. But of course, met as in found out about after he died. Like, so they never actually met, but it's almost these kind of, you kind of talk about in the book, these kind of the post-resurrection appearances of Christ to people, to, in that way that and again, that kind of goes to that whole point of the martyr being a malleable thing, and being something that exists in a way entirely separate from the actual life where they were breathing and blood pumped through their veins.
Yes, I mean, and it speaks to a particular moment there at the end of the 20th century where there's getting to be more mainstream representations of LGBT people in popular culture, but not quite yet. So if you weren't tuned into Will and Grace, if you weren't following Ellen, then hear Matthew Shepard write. For many people, they were like, oh, this is the first gay, and they were right. This is a quote, the first gay person I ever met. But obviously you didn't meet him. The martyr version of him is not a real person. His mother even acknowledges this in the preface to her book that she writes. She says something like, you knew him as Matthew. To me, he was Matt. Let me tell you about the real person. And this acknowledgement that in death, he very quickly became this other thing, and that wasn't necessarily her son. So, but it reminds me of sometimes, when some Christians will say that, that Jesus is the only Jew they've ever known, and these are not, you don't actually know. So
yeah, that's scary. Yes. And I think another thing that, so we've talked a bit about how, you choose this period because it's the shift away from AIDS being the, it's no longer the rallying cry has to be drugs into bodies, right? It's changed a bit to be, and so what it shifts, as we see, is around marriage and around military and around hate crimes kind of thing, but particularly those first two again, which point to, I guess, why kind of the monogamy becomes such an important part too. And so again, I was curious about your thoughts on, as you're looking at this whole project and the different figures, about how, because there's definitely been a fair bit of critique around the singular focus almost around marriage equality. And that's been the same in Australia. Like, I went to an event held with some of the original people who marched in the first Mardi Gras here, when it was a riot before it was a pride parade kind of thing. And they kind of talk, they're all sort of 68 and they were young then, so what, they're maybe 50s, 60s kind of now, and kind of all talking about marriage was just not the thing we were caring about at all. But and to varying degrees, some were like, but you got to support the kids, and others were like, and we still don't think, it varied within, but there's definitely been critique around that becoming the singular focus, and particularly the way that it, again, like the kind of the choosing of who gets martyred, privileges and highlights certain kinds of people in the LGBTIQ community and certain kinds of relationships within that. And I'm just curious to think about the, as you say, through that time period, that relationship between that becoming the highlighted movement and the figures, and the way martyrs function in that movement too.
Right. So one of the concerns that many people have expressed is that here in the United States, here in 2021, you can get married everywhere to someone of the same gender. But in more than half of the states within the United States, you can be fired from your job or evicted from your home for being LGBTQ, and you have no legal recourse then. You know, they're valid reasons. And so there are many people who felt like there are, very sort of things like about housing and your livelihood that need to be dealt with first over marriage. And to your point, right, that many people who are already, doing fine, who are middle class, are going to benefit from marriage and not face the repercussions. That is and is not true. I mean, there are many reasons why people shifted and started to support marriage. AIDS is part of that story because many people were unable to, visit their partners in the hospital. Many were unable to inherit what had been their partners. Many were blocked by biological families from having anything to do with funerals. So there were a lot of ways in which marriage became, for many, sort of a simpler solution to this problem. At the same time, the push for queer people to be married came with this associated expectation, basically, that everyone would promise to be monogamous. That if marriage will be expanded to include two people of the same gender, that we cannot open Pandora's box and allow anyone to speak publicly about a marriage that involves any type of sexual relationship with more than two people. And, obviously it's sort of like a public secret that heterosexuals have also not, adhered to monogamy in lots of different ways. It's often, men are given more leeway and a lot of sexual regulations are focused more on women and what women have to do. But now the burden of all of this was largely placed on queer people to promise that they would be monogamous. And so this, in terms of the martyrs, so this is, of course, as we talked about with Harvey Milk, why his sexual ethic had to be rewritten. Then you have Matthew Shepard, who's now becomes a desexualized adolescent who his image can be used for marriage, but his sexual, there's sort of no representation of him as a sexual person. We're not told stories about him with boyfriends, etc. And then the next figure that I mentioned in the book, Tyler Clementi, is a little more complicated because he was said to have been outed by his roommate when he was having a sexual encounter in their college dorm room, and that the roommate had set up this camera to spy on him. So he was clearly someone who was queer and having sex. But by that point in 2010, we've now moved along far enough that for many Americans, for many straight Americans, it seemed within the realm of what's normal that a college student, gay or straight, would engage in hookup culture, right? So college now, college functions as sort of liminal space where people aren't expected to adhere to only having one sexual partner. That it's like, and gay people got to be included in that. And it's sort of like you do that in college, and then you'll move on through these natural steps of adulthood, and then you'll settle in a monogamous marriage. And so it was so that him being someone who sex was part of his story, that didn't affect him becoming a martyr, speaks to now a broader cultural acceptance that queer people in college are part of this idea that you're going to hook up with people probably, and then you'll move on to appropriate monogamous marriages a little later.
And with him, it's like, and it was happening within his private space. We all think we should have that there. It wasn't being flaunted or gaudy. It was that. Right. That was the betrayal. That I wouldn't want that. To be seen in my home. Yeah. I think that's really. Thank you for that. I think that's helpful. So, I guess what becoming slightly into the land, the plane. And I think we've already kind of covered a lot of, I guess, why this book is important, not only in documenting a interesting activist move, but why, it shows the impact it has, the choices that are made and the effects that has on a whole community. I guess, is there any kind of parting what, as you're thinking, as it moves outside of 2015 and going beyond and going forward, thoughts on the way, lessons that people can be taking from looking back at this 20-year period. I know a lot of people have been thinking about, a lot of the language and policing around COVID and the behavior of people, and have been looking at, similar ways that, AIDS crisis and that, was talked about and that, but just curious about, any final kind of thoughts as you've been thinking through this book, and even in the, now a little bit of time that it's been out and engaged with, thoughts that you have on those kind of maybe something that people can be keeping in mind as they move forward in going forward.
I mean, I think one thing is that if you've only ever thought of LGBTQ politics and religion as opposing forces and working in opposition, that for me, that overlooks, both historically and still to the present day, how religion has shaped so many of the parameters of who gets to count as an acceptable citizen. And that certainly hasn't ended, and it continues. And if we are always stuck in this binary of it's, the religious people versus the queers, that not only overlooks queer religious people, but it overlooks the power of so much of religion to still set the parameters of inclusion, and it's quite powerful. And then in the United States context, that so much of that is shaped by a certain type of Protestant Christianity. And if we don't want Protestant Christianity to be what delimits who's acceptable, how our sex lives should be, if we want to think about more capacious, expansive forms of ethics and relationships, then we need to note how so much of this has framed our political movements. And then I think the other thing is, I have this one chapter on sort of failed martyrs, or attempts to get people who were people of color or who were trans to become well-known. And I think that is a project that remains underway and remains one that is quite complicated for people to really care, not only to care that, for example, trans women of color are face threats of violence and actual violence routinely, but that if we only ever focus on death, this goes back to one of your earlier questions, and how to make meaning of death, we also overlook all of the conditions of people who are living their daily lives that are not good, and how we need to improve them. And it's those things that really need emphasis. And if we're always, so why I think it's important to, make better known people of color, for people of color and trans people who've died, I'm always nervous about what the process when someone becomes a martyr and we only focus on death, because it's the daily lived life of particularly trans people and those who are non-binary queer people of color that we have to address in lots of different areas, from schooling to prisons to healthcare, and that too easily gets overlooked if we just turn people into martyrs.
I think that's really helpful, and goes back to kind of the very beginning of the book about the, very beginning of our conversation, so about the it gets better, because that's a very loaded assumption that it does, that all gay people, as long as you stick in there, you'll get to participate fully in all the blessings and fruitfulness of this wonderful society in which we live. It becomes very lots of problematized assumptions there, that only if you only live a little longer, you will live better. And it's like, well, as you say, not necessarily the case. Thank you for that and this wonderful conversation. I think folks, we've kind of focused our conversation predominantly in the first couple of chapters today, partly because you got to make choices when you're doing an interview, but also because, folks, there's huge amounts we haven't even talked about. You even heard about reference to a chapter about failed martyrs. We haven't even discussed that except for that last bit. So do go and get the book, because it is a rich, wonderfly written, really engaging and helpful book. And so I really encourage you to go check it out. Dying to be Normal, out now with Oxford University Press. Go and check it out. Brett, is there anything else you want to promote? How can people connect with you, your work, with The Revealer? yeah, what else? Anything else you want to promote at this moment?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Brett Krutzsch. And so I'm the editor of an online monthly magazine called The Revealer that looks at issues of religion and society, often how religion intersects with race, politics, and sexuality globally. And so people can go to therevealer.org. Great.
Thank you for that. And thank you very much for joining us today. And we'll see you all next week, folks. Thanks for coming on by.